So I'm going to lead off with an OQ just to get this started. All right. So what I want to start this discussion off on is, what do you guys think the commonality between the deaths of the hunger artist and Gregor are? In other words, what makes them different? What makes them similar? And in other words, is there a unifying thing between them?
I think that they're both similar in the way that they are desperate to find meaning in what they think is important. I don't necessarily think that what they're doing is important, but just the hunger artist, how he couldn't find anything he liked to eat or whatever, but he stuck to that even though it's essentially what caused him to die in the end. Stuck to it. I was saying this in class, I feel like he kind of found meaning through that because I feel like he didn't feel like he belonged anywhere else. And I also feel like we see that in Gregor too, how even when he's still a bug and his family is kind of neglecting him. I remember at one point in the book, I think it's in part 2, he hears them when they're eating dinner, and they're saying how are we gonna make money? And he literally throws himself at the door and is so guilty that he can't do anything for them. So I think they're similar in that way, where they're just desperate to have meaning.
Do you think there's a kind of similarity between, how the hunger artist rattles the cage and starts shaking it when someone suggests that he's irritable because he's hungry? But yeah, do you think there's a parallel between that and what you're talking about with Gregor flying at the door? With the money thing.
I mean, it's two different emotions. I feel like Gregor's more guilty, and the hunger artist jumps at the bars out of anger. But yeah, I guess you could parallel them.
I also think they're kind of different in the fact that the hunger artist isolates himself from society, from the people around him, into the cage, and Gregor didn't do that. He just woke up as a bug, and he just throughout the story is still seeking the human affection, even if he doesn't want to scare his family or ruin their lives, because that's what he feels like he's done. He still yearns for that. When he goes out of his room and tries to comfort his mom or whatever, and she freaks out. But the hunger artist is just sticking to being in his cage, and he may want the human affection, but he's not trying for it, or he doesn't show that he wants it at all. He might want attention, but I don't think he wants affection or human interaction.
Yeah, I agree with those both, and I do think that the commonality with even the differences is that isolation. I mean, they both died isolated, whether it was by choice or not by choice. In the end, they died isolated.
I actually think I disagree with Miss Fairbanks. Miss Fairbanks, you would agree. Greta, her sister,
Greta.
sister comes in. He hides under the sofa. It doesn't seem and he's always hiding himself, and it doesn't seem like he particularly enjoys when they come in to give him food. And it doesn't seem like Gregor's isolation is so much pushed on him from the outside, especially in the beginning, as it is self-imposed. I mean, you get the sense throughout a lot of Gregor's kind of inner conversation and the way that everyone else describes and talks to him, that he's kind of an isolated person from the beginning. So I think there's more unity there in a kind of self-imposed isolation than we're thinking. Maybe not to the same degree as the hunger artist, but...
Yeah, I think he isolated himself with his work. He worked so much for his family that basically didn't really give him a social life, because he was so focused on that.
I think a parallel between the two stories is dependency. In Metamorphosis, the family was dependent on Gregor, and Gregor realized that, and I think a natural end result of that sort of dependency is that when he can't provide for them anymore, then they're going to not really, love him like a normal family would. So he is isolated because he is no longer, he realizes they aren't dependent on him anymore. And in The Hunger Artist, I think there's some sort of commentary about, the hunger artist is trying to call out society about, don't be dependent, because if you are dependent on something too much, then, you're going to be isolated. Just saying, I don't know. I forgot where I was trying to go. I was going to...
Good stuff to bring up nonetheless.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how, talking about similar themes in like work about Mr. He said like there's no social life for Gregor, and I think that's like the same factor for the hunger artist as well, because like he chose this life, so like he was able, if he wanted to actually just go out away from the circus, but he chose to do what he wanted to do because he wanted to teach others about dependency. So like I think that's also like a unifying theme between both stories too.
My question? Mine's more about the metamorphosis, but I was wondering, do you guys think that Gregor had to die in order for his family to change? I know that in the beginning, I was like, oh, like, could he changed into a bug? Like, maybe that's the metamorphosis, or I figured that he was going to be the one who changed. But in the end, I feel like his family kind of did, so do you think that his death was the only way for his family to truly, like, metamorphosize?
I mean, I still hold to what I said before, which is that there's no justice for either character, and for Gregor especially, there isn't any. I mean, the family is not very sympathetic. You don't really sympathize with anyone in the family. You sympathize most of all with Gregor. The family treats him pretty badly, especially because you get Gregor's inner thoughts the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, after Gregor just dies peacefully in his sleep, and they wake up and find it, they just get the maid to move the body. Actually, they don't ask the maid to, the maid just says they did it, and they just fire the maid. Just like that. It's really kind of anticlimactic, and they just decide they're going to move into a smaller apartment. There's no grieving, there's no nothing. In fact, everything needs to get better after their provider dies. It's a really kind of odd thing that's not really what you'd expect.
And I kind of wonder if there's something to say to the fact that the maid was the one who found him dead, and not anyone in the family. So like the fact that the family was so distant in this sense, not even they found him. Not even they found him dead, and I don't think they really cared.
Do you think that adds to my interpretation or detracts from it?
I think it adds to it.
Because I think, and despite the fact that a lot of you guys might disagree with it, I really think I don't think these stories are meant to be hopeful in any kind of way. I don't think they're meant to really even play out any kind of way to help people. I think they're mostly a commentary on the world and how it works, and how the world itself acts in an absurd way.
It goes off to like teaching, like there's a teaching factor from like the hunger artist, and I think that's like what Kafka wanted to show is that like that the whole idea of dependency is like something that we need to realize, that we need to change the way like how we interact and how we like think or how we even treat people because of how Gregor, like his family, like they turned on him once he wasn't able to provide for them. So, but I think it was also like that it was also teaching for them because their son was providing for their whole family. I mean, just because his mom had asthma and his dad was kind of old doesn't like deter from the fact that he shouldn't have been like the breadwinner of the family. So I think that was like a huge factor.
I think in an effort to try and answer your question, I'm going to ask a question. Do you think Gregor is to blame at all for, or do you think he is exempt from all blame for how he's treated? Like he woke up just as a bug. That's not his fault. But the events prior to that, like, is he really like? It just seems like that sort of alienation by his family. It seems like a very natural thing to occur if all the family is concerned about is depending on him and nothing else. So, I mean, is he exempt from all blame for how he's treated them?
I think he should have been treated better. That's like, well, because I mean,
You're a good person.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I would assume right away. But like, I think that the actual shock of him turning into like a bug definitely plays a factor because, as we're talking about, like that was like so like not like you can't predict that. Like, you're just gonna one day turn into a bug. But then, yeah, I think that it should definitely treat him better.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, he should be exempt from all blame because he did what he was supposed to do. He worked, he provided for the family, and then this happened to him. So
I think the question on that is like, sure, providing for your family is in itself a good thing, but if all the family is interested in you is for you to provide for them, then like, should you realize, I actually care for my family. Is there another way I can help them live a happier life? Because when he can't provide for them, then they go off and provide for themselves. So like they are able to without him, but he doesn't really recognize that until after he changes. So trying to tie it all in again. On page 91, he's talking about pretty much why he is so sad now, it seems like. He says, instead, in like the middle of the page, instead he was filled with rage at how poorly he was attended to, and although he could not imagine anything he would have liked to eat, he plotted how he might gain access to the pantry so as to help himself to what, despite his total absence of hunger, what was due to him. What was due to him. He felt like his role in the family is that he should, you expect some sort of treatment in return to your own sort of treatment. You know what I'm saying? Like you're supposed to take as well, but they didn't.
Yeah, especially like after like all that he did and stuff, he expected like something in return.
So your question was like the change and everything in him and the family. Then could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Do you think that Gregor had to die in order for his family to change and like not be so lazy and move on with their lives? Like, what if he stayed alive as a bug? Do you think they would?
He would have continued enabling them.
Yeah.
I think they would have changed still, because they started changing like as he was a bug. You know, like they all got jobs. They didn't like it, but that's part of life.
That's because they had always been dependent on it.
Yeah.
I think if he wouldn't have become a bug, they would have still been dependent on him because he didn't care. He was okay doing it.
Yeah.
He wasn't bothered by working for his family at all.
And they took it for granted. They were
Yeah,
like,
it sounds like a
accustomed to
habit.
it.
It sounds like a habit of him being such a workaholic and like drowning himself in work, like you said, kind of isolating himself with his work because that's what he felt like he had to do for his family.
Yeah.
And so they fell into the habit of, oh yeah, Gregor, he's just doing the work that needs to be done, keeping the family afloat. And then when he changed into a bug, they had to change their habits a little bit, like get jobs and like start providing for themselves. But I feel like even if he had stayed alive, they would have just kept their jobs and like kept going until he eventually died in his room alone. Like I think it probably would have prolonged it if he had died later, but I think they would have just fallen into the same kind of habit. Like, oh, we go to our jobs, we come home, we eat, like we don't go in his room, like we don't touch him, like whatever. I think they would have fallen into a similar habit.
I mean, one thing that I found really odd about the story was that I think the metamorphosis in it is not actually Gregor's, I think it's Greta's. I mean, at the end of the story, where Greta gets up and stretches and that kind of thing, I think it's all, and her dad's realizing that she's like a woman now. And it still strikes me as really odd. It's like she made a reverse evolution to me. It's like she was a sympathetic character at the beginning of the story who really cared for Gregor and like even take care to see what he liked. And then on page 91, like he was referencing, it talks about how she would just quickly thrust some randomly chosen food stuff into his room with her foot on her way to work in the morning right with midday. Like she barely cared for him anymore. And it's mentioned that he looks weak, but like when they find him in his bed dead. And I think that his sister's lack of care for him ended up indirectly or directly at him. It just never made clear, leading to his death. I'm not quite sure that it signals a positive evolution, but it's made to look so positive at the end. I can't see what message Kafka would be trying to give by that. That's some kind of ironic thing, I don't know. But
Me either. I really can't figure out what.
the only thing that makes sense to me in interpreting this book is the absurdity of it. That's the only thing that makes sense. Is that there is nothing that you expect, or that you can't expect anything, or just point to something and say this is right, or this makes sense to me. That's the only thing. That's the only thing that's consistent throughout this story. Is that you can't do that. Does anyone else disagree? Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't really go into that. But going into a hunger artist, so I have multiple questions. But I guess to lead into the main of here, I guess I would start with like first looking at the entertainment industry, or artists and all these people that provide for audiences, whether that's in theaters and things like that. Could we call an act a performance if no one recognizes it as such? So like the fact that he was starving himself, like we're like, oh, that's not art. Like what the hell? That's not okay. But could it be called a performance still?
I think it's a performance because he was still put on display for others. Like even though he was next to like the panther who got most of the attention, he was still not like providing a service, but like showing off to the audience. Even though they didn't understand what he was doing, they only saw him as just starving himself. They didn't understand why, and that's why it's so important of the scene where he's like shaking the cage, because it's kind of the imposer, not imposer. Impresario, and it's like brushes it off because of like it's supposed to be a show for them, even though like the emotion you see from the artist like shows it's more than that to him. So I think that's more of like a perspective of like the actual artist itself more than is it a presentation for others. Even though like they might not understand, like go back to your question, you might not understand the process, but like people like stood there and like watched him like talk to him to get a better understanding, even though if they didn't have an understanding before they actually saw him. So.
And then something else that I was pulling around is like, so how I know we've mentioned a lot on dependency, and in this specific story, you would say that the hunger artist is dependent on the audience, or on people coming to see him, because obviously he's not dependent on food.
Mm-hmm.
And then being that or the entertainment industry, I guess you could look at it in general, is dependent on audience, on us to watch, pay for it, et cetera, et cetera. So who holds the power on both sides? Is it us, or is it the entertainers? Or in this case, is it the hunger artist that holds the power, or the audience?
Well, I think whatever either does the judging or sustains the other is to be at least prior or superior to the other. I think one can't exist without the other thing, and I think that's the art without the observer.
Yeah, like he was talking about how, like in the first paragraph, he's like, in the last decades, interest in hunger artists has declined considerably. Like, they depend on each other. So like when people started getting, like the audience started like becoming not interested in it anymore. Like he may have still been performing, but without the audience there to like witness it, he became very like sad and depressed about like not being able to get his message across.
Yeah.
So I think like the audience, I feel like has a little bit more power in the fact that like they determine like what's popular and what's not, like in terms of like media and like commodities and all like entertainment like thrown at us nowadays. Like we decide what's like in and what's not. So I feel like we have a little more power than that entertainers do.
I think that like you could tie this to Prospero with like the audience factor, because like he like Prospero like made you think of one thing and then he did something else to keep you like not motivated, to keep you focused on the performance, and then like you need to like capture the performance as an artist. So that's like one of Ms. Fairbanks' comments about how like keep them motivated. That's like when they lost that factor when they saw the hunger artist. So that's like how he lost his audience. He lost his own audience from that. So
maybe as long as the audience is open to being entertained, then the artist has power.
Yeah.
But it all is contingent on whether the public is open.
It's like the investment level of like how long you could keep them like focused on what you're trying to perform.
I agree with Mr. Parker in that you can't have one without the other. Like they do go hand in hand, but I definitely think that the audience is superior. I feel like you can relate that to anything though, like politics, like trying to start a movement or anything. If you're not saying something that people like, no one's gonna care about what you're talking about. You kind of have to do what the people want. So I feel like it's kind of in their hands. And this is probably really stupid, but all I can think of is like Taylor Swift. When she first started, she was like this country little like poppy girl, and now like she's completely changed to feed what her audience like demands of her, and like what the world demands of her, just to probably make more money and become more popular. But it's just like completely in our hands here.
So in that way, does art differ from other forms of communication? Or other ways of communicating something? In other words, what makes art different? Than like speaking, or just simple rhetoric?
Well, I feel like, I mean, thinking of the hunger artist himself, I think that, one, he thought he was more superior than his audience anyways, because he got angry when, people weren't necessarily understanding why he was doing what he was doing. So I think that's what makes art different. Like, art, we can think that we can, like, not even we can think, but, like, we don't necessarily always ask for art in a sense. Art is created because the painter or, the artist wants to express their feelings and emotions. We don't stand there and we're like, all right, I want a flower today. Like, not normally. Like, we want to listen to certain types of music, but it's rare. Most of us are sitting there like, all right, this is what I want painted. It's normally painted and then presented to us, and then we interpret it how we want to interpret it.
Yeah, that's what
I mean, but do you put in like a poll? So like do you like send in a poll to Taylor Swift? You're like, I want this next album to be like, I don't know, in the style of Bjork.
So is it a question of what is fine art and what is like?
Well, no, it's just what does art do that makes it different than other forms of communication? Because I think there's something.
I think art depends on like what you were saying, interpretation.
Yeah.
And the hunger artist, that's why he was like so frustrated, because they didn't understand what he was trying to express to them. And I think that was like their their separation was misunderstanding.
It's all understanding your audience in order to make your performance like fit their needs,
Right.
pretty much.
And he didn't understand society.
Yeah.
So he felt like apart from them.
When you're speaking to someone, I'm trying to think of like the presidential candidates or something. What they're saying, there is no interpretation. What you're saying has no. What you're saying is what it like. I don't know how to put this into words, but there's
They're saying
no.
it directly.
Yes.
Like,
Well, yeah.
telling you
Yeah.
like this is my
This is,
platform.
yeah,
like
this is my plan.
Not like
These are-
showing you a
this is what I
painting of
believe
their
in.
platform. And
It's
you
not like
interpret it.
I like overarching ideas, and they're like, "What do you think about that?" Like, no, it's just like this is what I believe in. If you want to follow me, you can. If not, you don't have to follow.
But one thing I think that's common between both of those, despite the fact that art is probably more indirect, I'd agree with that, is that you'll find that in a lot of kind of presidential speeches, there is no real logic in them. What it is pretty much rhetoric to get you to feel a certain way about how someone interacts.
They do tailor to the audience a lot because they want you to follow them, but it's also like they want a following from people who believe the same things.
Yeah.
And like, yes, they want to get elected, so like they may skew some things and like start cheers or whatever to get the audience going, but they do want people who believe the same things. Where I feel like an artist is trying to invoke like something that you may not think about that often or may not like believe in,
Right.
and they put it up for you to interpret and to figure out yourself.
Feel like a deeper meaning or something.
I agree with that.
But yeah, I think my question kind of ties into like what we've been talking about, and like, so thought about like the overall aspects of Metamorphosis and the Hunger Artist, and then I kind of took a step back and looked at like the time frame in which they were both written in. So like the early 20s, and like how that whole era was like a revolution within itself. So I said like, do you think Kafka formed these things of work, relationship, and the overall like interaction with people due to the time period he wrote in like the early 1900s with like the immigration and how people were moving, and like how work was such a staple for like family, not only family growth, but just like family, not togetherness, but like some type of unity, I'll say. So the dynamic, yeah.
I mean, I didn't know the timing. I knew the timing was written in, but I didn't really think about it. But now that you say that, I think think that makes sense. I mean, normally I think when somebody writes something during their time period,
Yeah.
sometimes it relates to what they're experiencing or seeing or whatever, even if it's in the slightest way, it tends to influence what you're doing. Even the music that people produce, you know. So I do think that would make much sense, especially
Because like you
with
have
metamorphosis.
Gregor was like working,
Right.
like, that's like huge. Like all he cared about was work, and then you have a hunger artist is like caring about like people's like understanding. So like could be like a cultural thing, like how like the melting pot of America, like people had to understand different cultures, and like people didn't get that like those ideas like until after the fact. So like to create that friction that he had between his audience. So that's why.
I think so. I think that makes sense. It's interesting.
With respect to like work and stuff like that, in specifically the metamorphosis, it's kind of sad, like Mr. Parker said, it's not like a happy book at all. And the person you're kind of rooting for the whole time dies.
Yeah.
And I feel like he's, in a way, kind of just saying like, you gotta just like kind of do your own thing and like worry about yourself. Because Gregor put everything into his family, and he's the one that lost in the end. And the ones that were selfish and cared about themselves and were just trying to do them, they're the ones who ended up fulfilled in the end. Which is, I think, personally, horrible outlook on life.
Yeah.
And very sad.
And then
But
he like contradicts it with the hunger artist kind of, because like Gregor only worked for his family, like that's all he did, like all day long was care about his family, work for his family, like make money for them. And it obviously didn't work out for him in the end. And then in the hunger artist, like he did like the only thing he like thought would make him happy, like his entire life. Like he isolated himself and like was trying to get this message across, and like really seemed like he was doing it for himself as much as he wanted the audience to like understand his message and like understand what he was doing. Like he tried to do what he thought would make him happy, and it also didn't work out for him in the end. So like I feel like both paths are just horrible outlooks on life.
What it's-
what
what
I'm
it's-
trying to say. What do you want?
Maybe it's a commentary on, like, yeah, you're right. Gregor did give everything and he didn't get anything in return, so maybe it's a commentary on the family. Hey, you need to love your family. Like, it's your fault that you did this and it turned out this way. So maybe it's a commentary on what the family dynamic is.
I was initially going to be more positive on this book. I was like, I'll be honest, because I was reading it, and there's this kind of stoic idea. I was like, okay, it's got this kind of stoic idea that like virtue's the only good thing and vice is the only bad thing. You know, he's going through it, he's doing the right thing, he's gonna have some kind of noble death. No, he just dies and everything gets better. Like I'm just like, so there is nothing redeeming. All right,
Can
I
I
mean,
sneak my OQ in really quick?
Go
Because
for
I feel
it.
like it goes along with everything we're saying. Okay, so is the reason for like their deaths, their alienation from like people, like Gregor, we said, kind of alienated himself with his work, and then when he became a bug, like isolated himself even more, and then the hunger artist like completely isolates himself in like the cage. So is the reason for their deaths like the lack of like human affection and like care, or is it more like a lack of effort on their part in trying to like find a better life for themselves?
Can you repeat the last bit of it?
Okay, so basically, is the reason for their deaths like their alienation from human affection or care, or is it more of like on their part a lack of effort in trying to find a better life for themselves?
So I think it's a bit of an interesting case because in regards to the last part of that, the hunger artist probably Gregor's obviously kind of in a bit of a predicament. He's an insect. It's kind of hard to make a better life for yourself as an insect. The hunger artist is in a different kind of one. He just doesn't, nothing satisfies him. It's a different kind of thing. I don't think it's about self-betterment. I think it's just they're both so isolated. And it doesn't seem like they're being punished for being isolated. Is the thing. It's like it's there, but it's not like Kafka never seems to go out of his way to be like isolation is bad. Like he doesn't seem to be like endorsing any kind of like unity people. I don't know.
I think that those two things could kind of go together. I think that Gregor, like we were saying in class, like both of these guys are so absurd. Like I just thought it was weird that even though his family just kind of like alienated him and everything, he was still the whole time talking about how he couldn't support them. And just like that's the only thing he was worried about, which I thought was really weird. And then the hunger artist, I feel like what was the last part? Like human affection or
Lack of effort and trying to find a better life.
yeah, I think it is lack of effort of trying to find a better life, but I think that they don't think they have a bad life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So like, I mean, to each his own, I guess. Everyone has their own ideas of a better life, but I think that they think they're fine and people need to, like, I feel like they think people need to see that they're fine. So like, it kind of is their fault for not having lack of affection at the same time. Like, I feel like those two could go together. If that makes any sense.
I feel like they were like each called to do their certain like, I guess like action or whatever they're doing. Like Gregor feels like he was called to somewhat work for his family, provide for his family, and then the hunger artist, like artists, we don't really understand what goes on in their minds, but I feel like he feels like he was called to do this. So there's like some kind of like again like an understanding that we don't understand, and I think that's the same thing with Gregor.
Is that all we've got?
I think me and yeah.
I kind of touched on it when I was trying to answer. I was just saying, like, is Gregor really exempt from all blame? Like, did he kind of do it to himself that he died the way he did? Because maybe I'm just saying, maybe he should have realized that by pampering his family for all the time, eventually when he couldn't do that, then like they might not return it to him. So when I'm just saying, should he have been surprised by the result?
I think you can only control yourself. If there's any blame, it's indirect. It's not like he can take his family by the shoulders and shake them and like walk them to the workplace and have them get jobs. I think he's only in control of himself. And perhaps indirectly is to blame, but at most indirectly.
I mean, it's not like his dad never worked. Like, his dad was working. So I don't think it's like, oh, my parents never worked, I'm the only one that's going to work, so I have to keep working. But I think it's more like, oh, my dad stopped working, now somebody needs to pick up the slack, so now I'm going to work. Not like, oh, I'm going to work because there's no one else to provide to everybody.
I think he is to blame. I think he's a doormat. Even when he found out after that, like, his father had, like, those little valuable things in the safe or whatever, and he's like, oh, I didn't know that before, that he could sell that for money and then like provide or whatever. He still after is just still concerned with supporting his family, and it's just like they don't care about you, and how do you not see that? You're letting them walk all over you.
Yes, I think it might be. I think this story seems to be like a commentary on the family dynamic. That sure, go ahead and support your family, but you should also expect something in return. And he didn't get anything in return, and he just let them walk all over.
Yeah, just like family affection.
Yeah.
Like just typical like mom and dad affection.
You didn't get the affection.
You got nothing.
Okay, and then mine. Going off of like that affection, like he wasn't getting recognized, Gregor. With the hunger artist, do you guys think that recognition that he depended on from the spectators somewhat acted as like a metaphoric food or nourishment? Even though he didn't eat, but like, do you think they were somewhat his source of nourishment? That's how I saw that.
I think I'd say yes and no. I think because I think yes, because that sounds really good. And it's like, oh, he doesn't eat, so like this is what would sustain him. But at the same time, I'd say no, because he'd get angry if they didn't understand him. So like, even if I'm there watching you as an audience member, but I'm telling you to eat, then you're gonna get mad at me. So am I really nourishing you?
But see, at the end, it says, because I couldn't find a food which tasted good to me. So maybe that food are basically people, like he didn't feel like society understood him.
But right, so does that mean the food that didn't nourish him was the people that didn't understand, that would understand him? but the ones that didn't wouldn't nourish
I
them.
see what you're saying.
And then he also, if that were true, I think he would have said, like, because he said he didn't find anything. If that were true, wouldn't he have made some kind of allusion, at least to the fact that it was the audience's support that nourished him?
Yeah.
That's